All right, so I want to mention a few things before we hop into it. I've been putting all kind of the old lectures in this folder. You kind of notice like there's these skeletons, and then I upload the complete versions as well. All right, so anything that was left out of the ones that I kind of made available at the beginning of the week, some things that we might have worked through, in class, or I added in kind of like what the answer was to iClear questions. All those will be in the complete version. So as we get closer to that exam, which will be next Friday, right, in class on Friday, not this Friday, next Friday, October 1st, right? Maybe if you want to use those slides to review, the best way is to go back and find any of those kind of slides labeled iClicker and kind of look at, make sure you could solve and get the correct answer. And like I said, those complete versions of the slides, those would have the correct answers in them. I also put up another kind of set of quiz problems that look like problems you might be able to see on an exam. This second one I wanted to mention, I might have some questions towards the end of it that we may not kind of cover or get to. We'll kind of see how this today and then Wednesday goes. So if that's the case, by this Friday, I'll let you know which questions you wouldn't have to worry about, right? And I also go back to this files tab, right? Yeah, so you've got kind of those two quizzes as kind of a good practice exam. I may get up towards the end of this week another practice exam that's like kind of more similar to the number of questions we'll see on the exam next week, and a little more abbreviated, just so you can see exactly what it would kind of a complete version look like. If you combine the two sample quizzes, that'd be a lot more questions than I'm planning to ask you on the actual exam. Okay. And we'll talk more about the details of the exam probably this Friday, right, a week prior to it. Any questions for me before we kind of jump into things here? All right, so we left off last week, talking about binding pricing, right? Whenever we had a market that was in equilibrium, but then the government comes in and says, the price for this good, it's gotten too high. We need to set a price ceiling and say, you can't set a price above this, right? This is like the highest kind of price we allow. I think we actually, maybe I covered price floors at the very end. So we'll kind of walk through price ceilings, be a little bit deliberate, thinking about the surplus changes that would occur, right? So if we have this old equilibrium, old quantity and price, right, we can kind of break this down into two areas. For now, don't worry why I've broken it down into these little portions, right? We can think about, we said that producer surplus was the area above the supply curve because it represented the costs, and below price because price represented the benefits to our producers, right? So kind of the difference between the price they can get and the marginal cost to produce that at every single quantity, well, that would represent the surplus of every unit they sold. So we add that all up, that would just be the entire space below price, but above the supply curve, because that supply curve represented marginal cost. We then said for producer surplus, that was everything above price, but below demand. Why? Well, because demand represented how much those consumers were benefiting, right? So the difference between that marginal benefit and the cost, or the price the consumer had to pay, we added that whole area up. That would represent the total consumer surplus derived from consuming, whatever quantity this ends up being of that good. So when we impose a price and say, okay, look, that equilibrium price is too high. We don't want you to be able to charge anything above whatever level they set, right? The binding price ceiling has to be set below whatever the equilibrium price is. The equilibrium price is 50 and you tell me I can't sell something for less than $100, I'm going to say, okay, I'm not, right? It has to be set below whatever the equilibrium price is. Well, when that happens, right, it's essentially going to end up with a shortage, right? The quantity demanded at that price much higher than the quantity supplied, right? Or the point that we'd be at on the demand curve is much higher than the point where we're at on the supply curve at that price. So at that price, right, we've got a shortage, and we can think about now, well, now what's consumer surplus? Well, consumer surplus is going to be the area underneath the demand curve, but above the price. Well, the price is no longer set by the market, it's been set by the government to be this price ceiling. So the difference between that price ceiling and demand, all the way up to whatever the last quantity in the market is. Now, here's where it gets a little bit different. than equilibrium because at this price, suppliers are only going to supply this quantity. So it doesn't matter that people are willing to buy more, there's not more to buy. So kind of if you want to think about the equilibrium quantity of this price ceiling is essentially whatever quantity supplied is, right? There's nothing brought to the market past that point. So that's where we're going to stop, right? We're going to see nothing consumed after that point because it's not going to be available. So now, right, before we had this nice triangle, well, now it's the difference between demand and the price that people are paying up to whatever that quantity is on the market, right? And that quantity will be wherever the quantity supplied is now. So it's like A, B, and C represents total consumer surplus now. So you kind of see relative to before, consumers have gained this new area, right, C, but they've lost, I'm going to go forward a little bit, they lost this little area E. For producers, producer surplus is the difference between the price they can get for the good, which is now this lower price ceiling value, and their marginal cost for the supply curve. So producer surplus has fallen quite a bit, right? Before, it was this entire triangle. So producer surplus has gone down, consumer surplus has potentially went up, but the overall market has lost out a little surplus, right? Because we're no longer selling these units, right? We're now at a quantity that's below what the market would have gotten to before. So all the surplus that we had before from selling between QS and Q star there, we've lost all that surplus, right? So is this a good or bad thing? Well, for society, right, for everyone involved, producers and consumers, we've lost, right? We have this, what we call deadweight loss area. Now, for consumers, it's potentially good, right? They lost a little bit of surplus here, but they gained a pretty big amount from, like, we kind of like transferred producer surplus to consumer surplus. So, you know, I guess if we think that these corporations are these big bad meanies, right, we might want to do this because we know we're going to kind of hurt them, but we're going to benefit the people purchasing their product. We think these companies are good and doing the right thing, right? Well, then maybe we're being kind of jerks by doing this. So that's the idea of a price ceiling. We've got this deadweight loss, right? We've transferred some producer surplus to consumer surplus. All right, so let's think about how we start calculating some of these values. So we introduced last class some work with equations for supply and demand. We don't have equations here, but we do have kind of these graph where we can identify the values or the points that we're at on the supply and demand. So what would producer and consumer surplus look like before we set this price ceiling? Well, it would have been the area, consumer surplus would have been the area above the price of 50, but below the demand curve. Well, now I just got this big triangle, right? So we said, how do we find the area of a triangle? Oh, my board's over here. I was just 1/2 base times height. So what's the height of my triangle here? Well, it goes from 40 to 90. So the difference between those two, right? 90 minus 40 is, or sorry, 90 minus 50 is 40. What's the base of my triangle? Well, it goes from 0 to 40. We've got what? 40 times 40 times 1/2. Oops. We end up with 800. What about producer surplus? Well, it's going to be the area below the equilibrium price, but above their marginal cost, or above that supply curve. Once again, it goes from 50 to 10. So that height is 40. The base goes from 0 to 40. 40 times 1/2. Wait, did I look at those numbers wrong? Oh, no, I did after first. I jumped the gun. Sorry. Here's producer surplus. Right? So producer and consumer surplus start out. We have this unique scenario where they're getting the exact same amount of surplus. Okay? If we then want to think about consumer surplus after the price ceiling, we said, okay, the government comes in and imposes this price ceiling of $40. It is binding, right? Because it's below that equivalent price. Consumer surplus is now the area above that price and below how much it's benefiting those consumers. So it's kind of that blue area. So we can find this, but it just takes a little bit more work, right? Because it's not a triangle now. We have the area of a triangle and then the area of a rectangle. But that's easy enough. I can find both of those and add them together. So the area of that triangle is going to be what? The height of that triangle is what here? So it goes from 90 to 60, right? So 30. And then what's the base? It goes from 0, 30. So 30 times 30 times 1/2. And then we would add to that rectangle, which has what? Length and width, however you want to think about it, right? Length times width. So 30 times difference between 60 and 40 is 20. Oops. So I take that 30 times 20, and then I add that to the area of the triangle that I found. All I'm doing here is looking for the area of these pretty triangles and rectangles, right? And add sometimes just a triangle, but right, nothing more complicated than that. Any questions up to this point? It's just going to get a little more confusing as we keep going. You okay with this? Okay. So what's happened to consumer surplus here after this price ceiling? Well, we said in the previous slide, what should happen is some of producer surplus would have been transferred to consumers. Right? So if we look here, consumer surplus went up. That's the whole purpose of a price ceiling. We're artificially pushing the price down. So what should happen to producers? Their surplus should go down. Right? Well, with this new price ceiling of $40, the difference between the price and our supply curve is going to be this green triangle here. We can find that area pretty easily. 10 to 40, that's 30. 0 to 30, 30. Right? So 30 times 1/2. And we can see that producer surplus is falling. Okay? Now, before we even calculate deadweight loss, you could actually tell me what deadweight loss is just from these numbers. How could you do that? Remember, what does deadweight loss represent? It represents that after this regulation, relative to like a free and open market, how much surplus was lost? So with these values, how could I find deadweight loss? Yeah, so not just producer and consumer, but what could I look at? What could I have think about this, right? So I look at what it was before, what was total surplus before, and then what was total surplus after. So if we think about kind of total surplus here, we're basically just adding up producer and consumer surplus, right? Those are the people that we have involved in the market. So before it was 800 and 800. So we had a total surplus of 1,600. What was our kind of maybe total surplus before? What's our total surplus after? Well, producer surplus was what? 450. Consumer surplus was 1050. Yeah. So we've got what? 1,500. The deadweight loss should just be 100, right? Total surplus went down by 100. Now, if we hadn't have already had made those calculations, a much easier way would be, well, if I look at this graph, I know that after the price ceiling, I'm going to be limited to this quantity. So relative to the equilibrium, I'm missing out on selling all these units. So I'm going to miss out on all of this surplus, right? Some of it was consumer surplus, some of it was producer, but that's the surplus I'm no longer going to be realizing. Right? So it's a triangle, so I can take the height, 60 minus 40 is 20. The base, 40 minus 30 is 10. 20 times 10 is 200 times 1/2 is 100, right? So it doesn't matter if we kind of just use the area on the graph or we think about the actual definition of deadweight loss, which is how much total surplus did we lose out on after this government regulation. Any questions over any of that? All right, so you guys know all of it, so I'll now ask you a few questions, all right? So I have a few eye-clear questions here. This will kind of help me see where you guys are at in terms of this idea of surplus calculation. So let's say we've got a market that's in equilibrium at 50, a price of 50 and a quantity of 40. Let's say instead the government comes in and imposes a price ceiling of $30, right? What is the amount of consumer surplus after this price ceiling is imposed, right? So we can't tell some of these points, right? At this price ceiling of 30, on the supply curve, we're at 20. On the demand curve, it's at 60. At that quantity of 20, we go up. that value is 70. And so hopefully kind of those values, this graphical representation, you should be able to calculate consumer surplus after this price ceiling of $30 imposed. So I'll give you like 2 minutes to kind of work on this, talk with the people around you. Don't feel like you have to be quiet. Part of working on this is it helps you kind of learn how to work through these problems. So maybe you understand how to tackle one part of it and the person next to you understands the other part. If you don't talk to each other, you're both lost, but if you talk to each other, maybe you can figure it out. Go for another minute here. All right. If you haven't gotten an answer in, take your best guess. I'm going to close it out here. So we've got what, 33 people here? Everyone got an answer in? Okay. So, anybody want to venture to guess? I showed you, but it should be 1,000. So how would you have found it? So consumer surplus, if you want to think about putting an actual, like, I usually try to refrain from too much math, right? But if you wanted to write this out mathematically, we have these things called like the summation sign. So start at the first, go to the very last quantity, and you're basically going to add up the difference between the marginal benefit and the price, right? So you would say, okay, what represents marginal benefit? That's demand. So I'm basically looking for, across every quantity, add up the difference between the demand curve and the price people are paying. But with a price ceiling, the price people are paying is no longer the equilibrium price. Here, I think I'm using kind of the notation of it's whatever that price ceiling is set. So we're going to be thinking about the area that we're looking at is above this value of 30, but below that demand curve. So if I think about the areas I'm looking for, I've got this rectangle where it's going from 30 to 70. And it kind of stops at, well, at this price, the last unit supplied would be 20. So I would take that difference. What I have, was it 80, I said? No, 70 to 30. So here's kind of like the length of my rectangle there. The width of my rectangle, I was going from 0 to 20. Right? So 20 times 40 there should give me 800. But that was just like part of the area that represented consumer surplus, because it goes from price all the way up to the demand curve. So there's that little triangle there at the top. I have to calculate the area of as well. Okay. So that little triangle goes from 90 to 70. So if you want to think about kind of the base of that triangle, actually, visually, I think that would look more like the height, right? 90 to 70. The base of that triangle goes from 0 to 20. Right? So take the difference from those two. And then if it's a triangle, to find the area, I have to multiply by 1. So this ends up being 200 I've now found the kind of two areas that would represent the total area of consumer surplus, which was 1,000. And just to kind of give you, I was trying to point to it, but I guess I'm a little bit shorter than I thought, right? The area underneath the demand curve, up to the quantity that we know will be the last quantity provided to the market, the difference between that demand curve and the price, so it's going to be this whole area here. Okay, so we found the area of this rectangle was 800, the area of this triangle was 200, giving us kind of that total consumer surplus of 1,000. Any questions over any of that? I'm going to keep asking a couple of questions. Okay. Not okay with it? What don't we understand? Okay, yeah, so one thing we have to make sure is what are we actually looking for, right? We have really three things we're going to be calculating. The first, I kind of already mentioned, is this idea of consumer surplus. That's how much are the people buying this good benefit? Well, their benefit is represented by the demand. The cost to those consumers, if you're purchasing a good, is going to be whatever the price is. Well, after the government comes in and sets this price ceiling, you can almost think about for every unit sold, your consumer surplus is just going to be the marginal benefit minus the price. That's kind of like the net benefit to the person. Well, what represents that marginal benefit in our market drawing, right? Well, that's the demand curve. So essentially what we want to find is the difference between the demand curve and the price that people are paying at every single quantity. So it's almost like if I had this, I had like an easier example where we didn't have a price ceiling. So like there's actually price ceiling is exactly equal to the price. Here's my price. Here's my supply and demand. I'm going to take as the first unit the difference between my marginal benefit or the demand curve and price. Then at the second unit, I can calculate that difference. Third unit, I can calculate that. I can keep doing that for every single quantity up to the last quantity that I know is going to be sold and purchased on the market, and adding up all of those consumer surplus at every single quantity, total consumer surplus. Now, because we have this actual kind of continuous function of this continuous demand curve, we don't have to go through the process of adding up each individual one. Really what we're doing in a way is kind of like calculus, right? We're finding the area under that curve, but above this specific price. But it's not hard to calculate. It ends up just being rectangle and triangle area calculation. We're not dealing with any kind of curves through this. The other thing we can find is producer surplus, which is the exact same idea. If I'm writing this out mathematically, I'm thinking about producer surplus is taking every single quantity sold, right? What's the difference between the price that they get to sell their good for, that's a benefit to them, and their marginal cost of producing that good, which we know that's represented by the supply curve. So when it comes to producer surplus, that was kind of like taking this all the way up to there. Producer consumer surplus will represent kind of total surplus there if we didn't have anything happening in this market. Once we have some government regulation, the third thing we have to worry about finding is this idea of deadweight loss. Right? Now, it's always going to be a triangle. I'll tell you that ahead of time. Deadweight loss will always be a triangle, at least in the examples that we're going to look at for this class. And so when it comes to calculating that deadweight loss, that was where we're really just going to be finding the area of a triangle, right? And it's going to be the triangle for which the quantities that we are no longer selling, right? We would have previously sold 40, but after this price ceiling, we know that the last quantity supplied to the market is going to get 20. So for all those units between 20 and 40, we lost out on all that total surplus, right? This triangle represented consumer surplus lost, this little triangle representing producer surplus lost. Okay. All right, so hopefully that helps a little bit kind of clarify things, just hearing it in a slightly different way. If I have the same setup, same price ceiling of $30, but I ask you to find producer surplus, this one should be a little bit easier. Okay? So here we've got that same price ceiling of $30, right? So that last quantity at $30 is 20. What is going to be producer surplus after this price ceiling is imposed? Give you a little bit of time to work on this one. Give you guys another 10 seconds here to kind of get your answers in. All right, so if you don't have your answer in, take your best guess now. I think there's 33, so let's make sure everybody gets their answer in. All right, perfect. So what area am I looking? I had to like say in words, what would represent producer surplus visually on this graph? It would be the area underneath the price, right? But above, visually on that graph, the area, the difference between the price, the area below price, and the area above, not surplus, but above supply, right? And really it's because supply represents marginal costs, right? So for the producer, the benefit to them is the price, the costs are represented by that supply curve. So we're really looking for this area right here, okay? The area below that new price ceiling but above the supply curve. So I've got a little triangle there, right? The height, difference between 10 and 30 is 20. The base, well, it goes from 0 to 20. So 20 times 20 is 400. So that's the answer, right? Now, what did I forget to do? Multiply by 1/2 because it's the area of a triangle. Should give me that answer of 200. Okay. Questions on that one? This is the shortage. The shortage for sure, right? Anytime we have these price ceilings, right? The quantity demanded is way higher than the quantity supply. Yep, for sure have a shortage. Actually, we could even say we have a shortage of how many units? Looks like quantity supply, there's 20. Quantity demanded would be the price of 30, 60. So we have that shortage of 40 units. Yep. All right, so same setup. Ask me to do one more. So I kind of really try to figure out where you guys are at with this. Okay? So same price ceiling. What would deadweight loss be? Right, so I'll give you a little bit of time to work on this. But relative to the equilibrium we would have had, right? Relative to this equilibrium price giving me producer and consumer surplus, right? And then the sum of those two being total surplus. What would my deadweight loss be here? Okay. As I think about the deadweight loss comes from the units that are no longer sold, right? So units that would have been sold under the equilibrium but are no longer sold because of this new imposed price ceiling. Okay. And it's hard to kind of remember the equilibrium quantity would have been 40.
We always gonna be able to check yourself with like equilibrium surplus for the producer consumer.
Yeah, I mean, it would take you a little bit more time right here. You have to calculate what it would have been prior, but yeah, you can always check yourself. So I'll address his question because it's a good question, but after this, but yes, that's good. We'll go to the 2-minute mark here. So another 30 seconds if you want to check with the people around. You guys don't have to be so quiet when we're working on this. I really don't mind kind of working with the people around. All right. If you haven't gotten an answer, I think there's one of us. Make sure you're getting an answer on this one. I'm going to close it out. All right. So I'm going to give you another visual. I'm trying to. I know I'm doing some of this stuff the same way, so if you're getting this, probably getting more. But I think seeing things different ways is always helpful. So if we didn't have a price ceiling, this is where we would be at, right? Producer surplus being the area below price, but above the supply curve. Consumer surplus being the area below demand, but above the price. If they come in with a price ceiling, if I've got this new price ceiling set somewhere down here, what's going to happen is this can no longer be producer surplus, right? Because it's above the price that the sellers are giving. So now, demand, right? Or sorry, the quantity supplied is going to stop at this point. So if we go up to that point with demand curve, all of this now becomes consumer surplus, right? Because now the area above the price that people are going to have to pay after the government imposes price limit is a little bit lower. However, we kind of lost out on this area up here, right? Because we're no longer selling these additional units. So we've got left with, here's my producer surplus. Some of it was transferred to my consumers, but there's also, for all these units that would have been sold if we didn't have a price ceiling, we no longer sell any of those, right? And so all of those units were essentially losing out on the surplus that could have existed. So when we're thinking about deadweight loss, it's the loss of total surplus. So if we think about total surplus here, I'm writing it out the way I was for producer consumer. I can actually write this out for total surplus as well. The total surplus would be add up the difference between what? I want to calculate total surplus. It'd be the difference between the demand curve and my supply curve, right? So if I'm thinking about adding this up between the demand and supply curve, so that demand curve represents the marginal benefits of that good being sold and purchased. It's my demand curve, the difference between that and the costs of providing that unit, which are represented by my supply curve. So when we're looking for deadweight loss, it's the total surplus, the difference between the demand and supply curve that was lost from all these units no longer being sold. Okay. So that triangle, right, will represent that area. Its height, 70 minus 30, so 40. The base goes from 20 to 40, right? I sold 20 fewer units after this price ceiling. So 20 times 40 is 800. And then what else? Triangle, so divide it by 2 or multiply it by 1. So 800 multiplied by 1/2. Okay. Any questions on this? Yeah. Say again. Like the actual numbers? Yeah, right. So if we're thinking about, we're trying to find that deadweight loss. We know it's going to be that little rectangle, triangle that represents all the quantity of the units that we're no longer selling. Right? So if we look at this triangle, we now, with a price ceiling, stop at 20 units, whereas if we were at free open market, we would get to 40. So all of these 20 units are no longer being sold, so that area between the supply and demand curve, that's all the total surplus we're using. So that triangle represents the surplus we're losing, that's deadweight loss. Right? So 70 to 30, right? That will be our base, right? We want 1/2 times base times height. So 1/2 times, well, I can get the height first. So our height was going from what? 70 to 30. Our base, we said we would have been at 40 units, but now we're only at 20, right? So 1/2 times 20 times 40 gave us that deadweight loss of 4. Questions on that one? Okay. So
What else? I think I've got one more, but I'm not gonna, oh no, I didn't. Perfect. Oh, I changed this one. I did have one more.
what if I already showed the answer, but what if I said you had a price ceiling of 70? What's the deadweight loss going to be in this market? It's a tricky one. If the price ceiling is $70, and the current equilibrium is at 50, what's going to happen? Nothing, right? The government says you can't sell that good for anything, you can't sell that good for anything above 70. Well, I'm not. Okay. So it's if nothing happens and your deadweight loss, because nothing has changed, would essentially be 0. Just another one you can think of. So where are we on time? We'll be all right. So just like price ceilings, we have the exact opposite with our price floors. Right? So a price floor is instead a minimum price that can be charged, right? So before the price ceiling said you can't charge anything above this point, a price floor is essentially like you can't go below the floor. You can't set a price below this value. So a really good example, and I don't think we'll use it today, but maybe I'll start the next class with it, is how the labor market, how the minimum wage works. I think I kind of alluded to this previously, but we'll jump back into it. We also know that an effective price floor has to be set above the current equilibrium price, right? If I'm currently charging $50 and you tell me you can't charge anything less than 30, I'm gonna look at you and say, okay, I'm not, right? So it's all fine, okay? Unlike a price ceiling, instead of a shortage, we now are gonna end up with a surplus. We'll kind of walk through why. It's ineffective if we would set that set that price floor below the equivalent price. Like I said, it wouldn't, kind of similar to price ceiling. If we don't put it on the right side of the equilibrium, it doesn't have an effect. So let's just look at a visual and think about how this is going to work, how surplus is going to change here. We start out, everything's great, total surplus here, the entire area below the demand curve, but above my supply curve. Okay? So I might be able to break these down into these areas just to kind of think about it. We'll see why later. We'll have, exactly thinking the cutoffs. So with a price floor to be effective, right? I'm saying you can't charge a price below this. I'd have to set it above the equilibrium price. That's when it's going to be what we would call binding. That actually makes some changes. So if I come in as a government, I set this price floor and say, look, you can't charge a price below this value. Well, at that price, the quantity demand, right, the point we're at in our demand curve, is much lower than the point we're at in our supply curve. So if the quantity demanded is less than the quantity supplied, we're going to end up with a surplus. There's more units out there than people want to buy. Okay? So we have now, it's hard to think about price floors in that before we said the new quantity after the price ceiling is just like the last one that was supplied. Well, now, yeah, there's going to be way more supply. There's going to be units out there on the market, but now our new kind of equilibrium quantity with this price floor is whatever the last unit people are willing to buy is, right? It's the last unit both supplied and consumed will be kind of our new equilibrium quantity. Okay? And so whatever point we're at in the demand curve, that's at this high price, that's the last unit people are going to be willing to buy. Okay? So it still has the same effect that the price ceiling did in that our new equilibrium quantity is lower than what it would be if the government wasn't involved. Okay? We'll have this surplus. We can now think about consumer surplus with this price floor. It's actually the area below the demand curve and above the new price, so it's actually going to be smaller. So price ceilings helped out consumers. Price floors are actually going to hurt them. And intuitively, that makes sense, right? The price is now higher. The price is now higher than what it was if it, we let this market be in equilibrium. For producers, right, they're going to benefit because the area above the supply curve but below price, right? Well, before they would have had this entire triangle. Now we go up to the last quantity that producer is able to sell in the market. Now the difference between price and that supply curve, we gain that area B. We've lost a little bit over here, but it's likely that the amount of surplus we gain is much greater than that amount, that little triangle area loss. Okay? It's possible that it's not, but more than likely it is. And then deadweight loss is going to be essentially the total surplus, the difference between the supply and demand curve from all these units that we didn't sell. Any questions on this? So it's almost like everything that we were doing before, just like the exact opposite. Right? Instead of a shortage, we have a surplus. Consumer surplus should be going down. Producer surplus should be going up. Deadweight loss works exactly the same, right? It's just the total surplus loss from those units we're no longer selling. Okay? So we'll walk through an example of how do we calculate these areas. I might go with this kind of quick. So what would consumer surplus be before and after? I think I have the exact same setup. So we've got an equilibrium price of 50, quantity of 40, right? If I want total surplus, it would just be the difference between that supply and demand curve. If I want producer and consumer surplus, I'm basically cutting that in half, right? Consumer surplus being the area above the price, but below my demand curve. So that triangle there has what, a height of 90 minus 50, so 40, a base that goes from 0 to 40. So 40 times 40 times 1/2 will give me consumer surplus. There we go. Oh, I jumped the gun here, but there we go. Producer surplus is the area below price, but above my supply curve. Base of 40. The height goes from 50 to 10, so also a height of 40. So this was the same sort of example we had before in the ICRA questions, where we end up with before producer and consumer surplus were exactly the same amount. Just the numbers worked out nice and neat. Okay? After this price ceiling, what is consumer surplus? Well, it's just going to be the area below the demand curve, but above our price. So it's this little blue triangle. Right? What's the height of that blue triangle? Well, it goes from 90 to 60, so 30. What's the base? Looks like it goes from 0 to 30, so the base is also 30. 30 times 30 times 1/2 gives us that new consumer surplus of 450. Any questions on that up to that point? So what if I wanted to find producer surplus after? Well, that's going to be the difference between the price and the marginal cost represented by the supply curve. So it's this entire green area. Why does it not include the red area? Well, because at this new price floor, the last quantity that we're going to be able to sell is actually 30. Right? So we're no longer going to be able to sell any of these units past, between 30 and 40. So now it's a little bit more work because now I have a rectangle I have to find the area of and a triangle. Right? So this green area is composed of kind of these two geometric shapes, and I can find the area of each one and then add them up. Right? So what? The rectangle goes from 60 to 40, so it has a length times width. 20 goes all the way out to 30, so 20 times 30, 600 or no? Yeah, 600. Right? That little triangle at the bottom. The height goes from 40 to 10, so 30. The base goes out to 30. 30 times 1/2. Right? Add those two together, and we get 1,000. Right? What would my deadweight loss be here? What's all the surplus or total surplus loss from these units I'm no longer selling between 30 and 40? Okay. What's total surplus? It's the difference between the demand and supply curve. So the entire surplus loss is represented by that little red area. That's just the area of a triangle. So if I'm looking at that, what's the base or what's the height, I guess, of my triangle there? It goes from 60 to 40, so the height would be 20, right? The difference between those two. What's the base, right? The base is going to be, well, it starts at 30, goes to 40, or how many fewer units am I selling now? 10. So 10 times 20, and it's a triangle, so times 1/2 should just be 100. Any questions over kind of? All right, so. If I increase this price floor, right? So I raise it from 60 to, I don't know, 70 or 80, right? What kind of impacts is that going to have on my deadweight loss? If I keep increasing this price floor so that instead of 60 now it's even higher to 70, what's going to happen to my deadweight loss? Going to have more of it. Why? As I increase this pricing, what happens to my new equilibrium quantity with this price floor? Well, fewer and fewer consumers are willing to buy the good, right? So as that quantity starts to go lower, basically I'm selling fewer and fewer units. I'm losing out on more and more surplus. The surplus I'm losing out on, that's deadweight loss, right? That's the amount of surplus I'm losing out on. Okay? What would happen to consumer surplus as that price floor increases? Definitely going to get smaller, right? As I raise that kind of red line, right? The new price floor, the difference between demand and this new price, well, if the price is higher, I'm just making that area smaller and smaller, right? So these higher and higher price floors are just going to hurt consumers. They're going to cause more deadweight loss in the market. That's a little bit trickier for producers. I can't really say without actually calculating it because, as I increase that price floor, the green area you want to think about, it gets like taller, right? The difference between supply and that price they're paying, that gap, that distance is farther, but there are fewer consumers willing to buy their product, and so I'm going to be losing out producer surplus kind of the width direction. So we can't really say anything about producer surplus for sure, but we know consumer surplus would go down, and we know that deadweight loss would go up as we increase this price floor. So it's good to be able to make these calculations, like that's part of this class, that's part of what I expect to do on the exam. But I also might just ask you a question like I just did and be able to think about, okay, what's happening? I don't need to know the exact numbers. I just need to be thinking about the concepts and the principles behind if this price floor is going up, what's going to happen to my new quantity, where these new areas going to look like, and kind of make some of those statements as well. Okay. Any questions on that one? You guys come through that? I'm not, but so I could ask you, right, to do different questions here. And that was me just kind of being a dick, but I really haven't too much done. But you shouldn't, just out of courtesy, I don't get bent out of shape about it. I know people in this building who, if you're still just now, you might get really bent out of shape about it. So I'm trying to kind of help you out a little bit. Right? Until the kind of class is dismissed, I wouldn't start packing up, or you might get called out by certain people. So I've got a set of clicker questions here that we could run through. We obviously don't have time to kind of run through all of them today. So what I would kind of recommend is before next class, this set of ICON questions where I'm asking you about consumer surplus and deadweight loss before we get to this minimum wage slide, try to work through those on your own. I'm not going to cover them in class. I'm not going to use them. It's very similar to what we're doing with the price ceiling. So make sure you can work through those, come up with the correct answers, which I tell you ahead of time are the exact same answers that we had for the price ceiling. So that way you know what the answer should be able to reproduce them. If you're having difficulty with them, reach out to me. Before next class, I'll also be putting up a video this afternoon that covers one of the next things that we're going to talk about. So I expect you to get on and watch that prior to us starting class on Wednesday. Okay, and I'll put an announcement up on Canvas. But other than that, have a good rest of your day. I will see you guys on Wednesday.